One of the easiest things you can do to make your site better is just to make everything load faster. But this is much easier said than done, especially when we start talking about prefetching and pre-rendering. It can get really complicated. That is until now with the brand new speculation rules API built into the browser. It makes doing prefetching and pre-rendering incredibly easy, but there are a few gotchas that you really need to understand, otherwise you could rack up a massive bill on your server. In this video, I'm going to be covering all the new stuff related to this API, showing you how everything works, and showing you these gotchas that you need to watch out for. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And to really understand how this API works, we first need to look at this really simple project where we're going to be implementing this to show you the problems that we have now and how we can fix them. So for this project, I have three very simple pages. I have a home page, I have a store page, and I have an about page. And you notice they're all pretty much exactly the same. They have a heading, they have the links to all the other pages, they have an image, and then they also have some JavaScript on the page. So if we look at one of the HTML files, you can see here we have some style sheet. This is mostly just for our image to make it so it's small enough to fit on our page. We then have a JavaScript file that's loading, and all this is doing is running some code that adds this timeout finish to the bottom of our page after 1 second, just to simulate what JavaScript looks like in this particular scenario. And then finally, we have our actual content with the heading, the links, and the image showing up on our page. So this is pretty much everything you would have in a normal page. We have HTML, we have CSS, we have JavaScript, and they're all doing different things. Now, right now, if I click on a link, it takes a little bit of time for that particular page to load. Right now, it's actually looking like it's pretty much instantaneous because everything is cached right now. So to get around that problem, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to open up my DevTools, go to the network tab specifically, and I want to make sure I have this disable cache checked. That's just going to make sure that we don't have any caching on our page at all to show how this would work for someone that's coming to your site completely fresh, because most likely they won't have any cache on their page. So once we have that done, we're just going to leave that open on the side. And now immediately when I navigate between these pages, it's going to be a much slower load. I mean, it's still relatively quick because my internet's quite fast. So we can go ahead and actually slow that down even more by coming into the throttling section here. We'll just change it to fast 4G. It doesn't have to be super slow to be able to notice what these load times look like. Now, when I click on this page, there's a little bit of a stutter, maybe half a second or so of time between when I click and when it actually loads up the page. This is what we're trying to avoid with prefetching and pre-rendering. These are two different techniques to try to make it so when you transition between one page to another page, it's much quicker. And all of this is done using the speculation rules API. If we look at the MDN documentation for this, it's a rather new feature. As you can see up here, it's very limited in the availability. Right now, it's pretty much only available in Chromium-based browsers, so Chrome and Edge, but hopefully eventually it'll come to Firefox and Safari. Now, if we scroll down, there's kind of two different ways we can define our prefetching and our pre-rendering. The first is by defining a hard-coded list of all the URLs we want to allow prefetching for. And then secondly, we can use this where syntax to be able to have a lot of more fine-tuning. For example, we can do certain things with like glob matchers and like regular expression matching. We can have like and or clauses. We can do like CSS classes. So if I give something a CSS class, it's going to be doing all the pre-rendering. This is probably where you're going to be at most of the time, is in this where clause. But I'm going to get started with this URLs way of doing things because it's a little bit simpler and easier to understand. So if we want to prefetch something, we first need to put it in a script tag. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to create a script tag. And this script tag right here is going to have a type. And this type is speculation rules. So I'm just going to copy this over so I don't accidentally type it incorrectly. And inside of here, you actually pass a JSON file, or a JSON object, sorry. Eventually, they are going to add support for adding in the source attribute, but right now there's no support for that, so you have to just hard code it in line, or you can technically use an HTTP header to point to a file, but for the most part, this is how you're going to be doing it. So inside of here, we define either prefetch or pre-render. I'll get into the differences between the two in a second, but I'm going to first start with prefetch. And then we come in here and we can pass an array of all the different things we want to prefetch. And that's because you can pass multiple lists of objects that all have different requirements. In our case, we're just going to be passing a list of all of our URLs. So we'll come in here with a list of URLs, that's an array. And inside this array, we're just going to pass our three separate URLs. So we're going to have our home page, then we're going to have our about page, which is just, about.html. Let me make sure I put a slash at the front of that. And then finally, we're going to have store.html. So this is just our three different pages that we're going to be doing our prefetching for. Now I'm going to copy this to all of our different files, so we have the exact same prefetching behavior in all of our different files. So now all three of our files have this prefetch in there, and it's saying anytime we encounter a URL that is either our home URL, our about URL, or our store URL, we want to do prefetching for those pages. Now you won't notice a huge amount of difference in our code. You'll notice it still has a bit of a lag time for when it loads up things. It may be slightly faster, but there's not a huge amount of difference. But we can actually see what's happening inside of our page by pulling over our DevTools. you may notice immediately it doesn't look like a ton of stuff happens. For example, when I refresh my page, you don't really see anything happening over here. You can see we got some prefetch cache going down here, but for the most part, not a ton of stuff is happening. What we need to do is we need to go to the application tab. This will actually tell us where everything happens inside this speculative loads section. So I'm just going to make this full screen so it's easier to see. And you can see we have speculative loads, we have rules to show you where all the different rules are, and then we finally have speculations. And this tells us exactly what we're loading and exactly the status of that thing. So in our case, we're loading these 3 URLs that we defined in our page. Zoom this in a little bit so it's easier to see. We have set them to be prefetch, and we can see that they are getting from this rule set that's in our store HTML, which is, if we look, the page we're currently on. And then finally, the status for all of these is ready, which means they have all been successfully prefetched onto our page. This is because by default, anytime you do prefetching or pre-rendering, it's going to get all the links immediately as soon as possible. So as soon as your main page loads, so in our case, as soon as this page loads, it's going to immediately start downloading all the different things that we're prefetching. And by doing the prefetching, what we essentially download is all of the HTML for the page. It doesn't download our images, it doesn't download our JavaScript or our CSS or anything like that. It's just downloading the actual HTML for the page, which in some cases is enough, but in this particular case, our HTML is very simple and our image and CSS and JavaScript are much slower. If we go back to our network tab, I'll clear all this out and I'll zoom it out just a little bit, and we'll click on our home page here, and you'll see that our actual local host, which is our home page, that was coming directly from our cache. So it didn't have to download anything, but you can see our CSS, our JavaScript, and our image all took a considerable amount of time to download because we're on this slower internet speed, which is why it has a lag time when I click on the link to when it actually shows up on the page. This is where pre-rendering versus prefetching comes in. So the idea behind prefetching is you get just the HTML of the page. If you do pre-rendering instead, this is going to download the HTML for your page just like with prefetching, but it's also going to download all of the other resources required. So it's going to get all your CSS, it's going to get all of your JavaScript, it's even going to get all of the different images. And by using pre-rendering, we can essentially make our page transitions instantaneous. You'll notice when I click on this store page that it should have been instantaneous. The reason it wasn't is because I only changed my pre-rendering in one of my locations. I want to make sure all of my pages have this pre-rendering set up. Now it doesn't matter which page I start on. We'll start on our home page here. When I click on any of my other pages, it's going to be already rendered, so it's going to be instantaneous. I'm going to click on the store right now, and you'll notice it instantaneously changed to that store page. Same thing, I'm going to click on about right now, and again, it's instantaneously changing between them. You will notice one really interesting piece of behavior though. If we look down here where it says timeout finished, this is supposed to occur 1 second after my page loads. You can see I call this main function 1 second after my page loads, it's going to add this text. But when I transition to a page that's already been pre-rendered, for example, I transition to my store, you can see that this text is already down there. And that's because by default, it's running all of your JavaScript, which means when you're pre-rendering the page, it's taking that page, it's rendering it essentially in another tab, but completely invisible, so you never actually see it. And it's running this JavaScript code. So it pre-renders the page, and then 1 second later, it adds this text to that pre-rendered version of our page. So all of that different JavaScript is running. That's a really important thing to understand, because if you have like analytics software inside of here that's logging like page views and stuff, you don't want that to run during the pre-render. Now I'm going to show you later in this video how to fix that, but we first need to kind of diagnose and look into a little bit deeper how this prefetching and pre-rendering works. So let's dive back into the dev tools here. We're just going to go over to that application tab again, and this again gives us a way to actually see which pages are being pre-rendered. Here you can see that all of my pages are set to pre-render and they all have a status of ready, which means they're immediately going to be accessible on my page. When I click the link, it's instantly going to show that content. This is a really great way to create super responsive websites without actually having to worry about making your site super responsive, because even if your page time is like maybe half a second to load, the first page will obviously take a half a second to load, but every subsequent page navigation is going to be essentially instantaneous as long as the user spends at least half a second on your current page. And again, if we look at the network tab, we can clear out everything and we can just go ahead and click on the home page, and you'll notice the things that are being loaded is essentially nothing being loaded on our page. Same thing here, if I click on store, there's essentially nothing being loaded. I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to click on about over here, and you can see there's nothing being loaded on the page because it's already all been downloaded. All that this is doing is just displaying the content on the page. For the most part, when you're dealing with this pre-rendering and prefetching, I find the network tab is really not that useful because it kind of has weird information that shows up. Sometimes it shows a ton of information, sometimes it doesn't actually show anything, as you can see here. And generally the page you want to look in is the application tab down by this speculative loads, which is essentially way at the bottom of the page. This gives you a much better idea of, did my current page pre-render? Up here, for example, it says this page that I'm on right now was pre-rendered, and it also says that 3 other pages are pre-rendered, my home, store, and about page in this particular case. Now you may notice immediately that there's a bit of a problem with this. What if my page had 100, 1,000, a million different links on it? Well, what's going to happen is it's going to make 100, 1,000, 1 million requests to get all of those different pages. This is a huge problem because it's going to put a giant load on your server, because if, again, you have 100 different links the user could click on, now every time they load a page, it's making 100 additional requests to your server. This is not only difficult for your server because it's going to rack up your bill, but it's also difficult for the user itself because now they're requesting 100 additional pages. This is not something that your user generally wants to do. Instead, they probably only want to prefetch or pre-render the page that they're about to click on. For example, when they are getting ready to hover the about link or the store link, or maybe as they're scrolling down through the page and something starts to show up on the page, then they actually want to show that particular thing as a pre-render or a prefetch. This is where, if we look back at the speculation rules and we scroll down a little ways, there's the ability to actually determine how eagerly you want to do this. This is set as the eagerness. By default, everything is set to immediate, which means essentially as soon as your page is done rendering, every single link that is set to be prefetched or pre-rendered is going to be downloaded immediately. Now there's also eager. Currently inside of Chrome, eager and immediate do the exact same thing, but the idea behind eager is it's like immediate but a little bit less aggressive. It may wait for the user to scroll down onto the page, or maybe they have to hover over the link for it to actually download, something like that. Now, moderate and conservative are much more conservative approaches. Not only would these two options not immediately download all the content, but they also have a limit on the amount of pages that they can download. Eager and immediate have a 50-page limit, so they can download 50 pages all at once, which is a lot of pages of additional request, while moderate and conservative will only download 2 pages at a time, so it's much more conservative on the stuff that it'll do. Now, moderate generally waits for someone to put their mouse cursor over a link before it'll start that download, and conservative is going to be even more conservative, where it generally waits for the user to actually start the click action on the link itself before it starts the prefetch. Now, we can actually see this in action. I'm going to go into our JavaScript for our page, and wherever we have this set up, I want to modify this to add in. Let me make sure I come into my URL section. Inside of here, I want to do my eagerness, just like that, and I'm going to set this right here to my moderate value, and that one is essentially waiting for the mouse over event. And I'm just going to copy all this code. I'm going to paste it into each one of these pages so they all have the exact same behavior. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to home page. I'm just going to refresh to make sure everything is set up from scratch. I'm going to go to inspect, and I'm going to go to my application tab, and I'm going to scroll down to my speculations, and you can see immediately the status for all these pages is set to not triggered. That means there's been no download at all. Now, when I hover over one of my links, for example, my store page, you can see when I hovered that link, it downloaded the page. You can now see the status is ready. If I hover over my home page, again, the status has been changed to ready. And now if I hover over my about page, you'll notice something interesting. First of all, the about page becomes ready, but my store page now becomes a failure. And that's because, like I said, you can only have 2 pre-rendered pages at a time between your pages if you have this conservative mode set of either moderate or conservative. So in our case, we're using moderate, so the max amount of pages we can have at a time is 2. So the oldest page just gets deleted, essentially. Now, if I try to hover over my store page, then the home page gets deleted because that was my oldest page that I had before. This just saves resources on your user's computer or phone because now there's only 2 pages being stored instead of 50, which is a lot. And again, it hopefully saves you some resources on your server because instead of making 50 requests, you're maximum making 2. And then if they do something else, it'll make a 3rd and delete the old one and so on. So I don't know why they made the default behavior immediate, because that is honestly the most costly for the user and for your server. I think something like the moderate mode should be the default. So generally when you're doing pre-rendering, I would set it to be something like moderate. So you're not doing way too much pre-rendering, like a ton of it. You're just doing pre-rendering when you particularly need it. Now in our case, let's say I go to my store page and I click, you can see it's still instantaneous to load this page. Now if I were to just hover and then click, there may be a small load time, but the time between when I hover the link and when I click it, and then when I release the click button and then the transition happens, that's probably going to be a couple hundred milliseconds, and some pages are just going to load in that time, so you're really not going to have any noticeable load time, even with this moderate way of doing things. But if you want, you can immediately load like really sensitive links that you think people are going to click on all the time. Those ones you can immediately load, and then the rest you can leave as a moderate load so they don't load nearly as many as you need them to. For example, if you're on a blogging site, maybe you have your like first blog on the page set to immediate, so that one's going to load immediately. That way it's probably the most likely the page the user goes to. And then all the other blogs on your page you can have set to moderate, so when they hover over one of the links, then it's going to go ahead and download that blog for them. Now, another thing to consider with all of this pre-rendering and prefetching is when I hover over this home link, for example, it downloads my home page and runs all the code with it. But that also means that it actually makes a request to my server. And if my server is doing something such as doing some type of analytics logging, or maybe I have like a user that has like a certain number of credits they can use so they can only access a page 20 times, I don't want to count the pre-render against that for them. Or maybe I don't even want to run certain things if I'm doing a pre-render. All of those different things you need to to make sure you take into account. So on the actual page that you're rendering, this is going to send along a HTTP header to the page that's essentially saying, hey, this page is being pre-rendered. So if you want to make sure that you don't do certain things during pre-render, you can check for that HTTP header. Also, you want to make sure that you don't just pre-render every URL on your page. For example, some people will have a logout button on their page, but they'll make it an href. So it's actually a normal thing like this, where it just says logout, and this will actually log out the user. Now, this is not a link that you want to pre-render, because this is going to log the user out if you pre-render it, because it's going to run your logout code on the server. Now, there's a couple ways to fix this. First of all, your logout page should not be an actual GET request. It should be something like a delete or a post request. That's for another video though. And also, anytime that you have something on your server that could happen, such as a logout effect, or like certain things in your database are changing, or you're updating analytics, all of those things are going to happen on pre-render. So you need to make sure that you don't actually render those pages as pre-rendered pages if you don't want those things to occur. Or you need to make sure on your server you check for those HTTP headers that get sent along to actually understand, hey, this is a pre-render, don't do this analytical related stuff. Now, this also kind of ties into the front end as well. As I mentioned, inside of our JavaScript, we have this set timeout for 1 second, and this is running immediately when our page pre-rendered. It's not waiting for our actual page to finish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to immediate for all of these. So I'm just going to copy this, change it back to immediate so we can get this working a little bit easier for our testing purposes. And now our page has been running for 1 second. When I click on store, you notice this timeout finish is automatically there. I want to essentially change this so that I only start this timeout when I actually go to the page and not when it's pre-rendering. We can actually really easily check for that inside of our JavaScript. So we have this variable called document.prerendering. This is going to be true if the page is currently pre-rendering, or false if it is not pre-rendering. So if the page is pre-rendering, I don't want to do this. But if it's not pre-rendering, well, then I do want to do this code. So I'm just going to move this up here. I'm going to say if we're not pre-rendering, then I want to call the code inside my main function right here. So what this is going to do is if I just refresh my page, you notice immediately it says timeout finished. Now, when I navigate to another page, you notice that does not show up my timeout finished code. But it'll actually never show up because I'm never running this code. Because essentially I'm saying, hey, this page is being pre-rendered, do absolutely nothing. So if the page is pre-rendered, instead I can listen to an event on my document, and this event is called prerendering change. And this pre-rendering change function is going to occur when we go from the state of pre-rendering to not pre-rendering. So essentially, when you have a page that's pre-rendered and you want to show that page, this event is going to be ran. It's essentially like the document load event, but specifically for when you have a pre-render. So in that case, I just want to say I want to call the main function. I'm going to make sure this only occurs once. So we'll say once true. And that's because I only have one instance where I'm going from pre-rendering to not pre-rendering. So now if I am not pre-rendering, like I load my page for the first time, all my code works just like normal. But if I am doing a pre-render, only run my code specifically when the page becomes active to the user. So to test if this is working, I can click on my store page and you notice that the timeout finish shows up after 1 second. Even though my page was pre-rendered and you noticed it loaded absolutely instantaneously, all the JavaScript code that I wanted to have wait until later, I have set inside of here so it doesn't actually run until my user goes to the page. For example, if you have analytics software that's tracking users where they go on your site, you definitely do not want to run that on pre-render, and you want to make sure that you only run that after the pre-render is finished and they've actually made that their active page. That's why this code is really important for things like analytics and other JavaScript that you don't need to run until the user goes to that page physically. Now, towards the very beginning of the video, I kind of mentioned how there's two separate ways that you can actually use this API. You can either pass in a URL or you can pass in a where clause. And this where clause allows you to do a lot of really fancy things. For example, one of the things you can do is href matches. And this allows you to use something called the URL pattern API syntax. It's essentially a fancy word for regular expressions and like standard glob kind of based patterns. Think about if you've ever used like Next.js or Express before, the way that you define your URLs using Next.js or Express routes, that's essentially exactly what this URL pattern looks like. If we click on this and actually look at the patterns, you can see things like having a star for a wildcard, using things like colon to actually do like named groups. We can do non-capturing groups and then full on regular expression. So it's a really powerful syntax to say that, hey, I want to match all the URLs that start with like /store, and then it's going to get all the URLs that start with /store. Another thing we can do is match things based on CSS selectors. So we can say, hey, anytime that I have a CSS selector of prerender, so like .prerender, the class of prerender, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I do this prerendering code. So this is a great way to do things based on CSS classes. And then we have our like logical ones. So we have and, we have not, and we have or. this just allows us to chain together some really complicated things to say, hey, do this in this particular case, and if this is true, but not if this is true, and so on. I don't know if they have any examples inside the documentation of these more complicated ways of doing things. It doesn't really look like it. I'm scrolling down to see one, but I can show you kind of what that looks like. You can see here they have like a where not, and they're specifically using that logout example in that case, which is a great use case. Here's a little bit more complicated of use case. You can see here they're doing a where clause, where essentially they're matching literally any URL at all, except for ones that are the logout page or anything that has the selector of no prerender. So anytime the class of no prerender is there, or it's a logout page, otherwise it matches every single URL, and that's just doing it for prefetching. Now again, if I was in this particular scenario, I would probably make sure that this was not going to be on the immediate level of eagerness, and I would do something like moderate or conservative to just save bandwidth, but it's up to you what you want to do. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about this brand new feature, and I'm really excited for when it actually comes to all the different browsers. And if you want to stay up to date with all the different bleeding edge features out there for web development, I'm going to link a couple videos right over here that cover some of the more up-to-date web development related topics, so you can check them out and stay up to date with everything that's really cool inside of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.